I was recently single and ready to explore the dating scene again. I had heard good things about Tinder, so I decided to give it a try. I swiped right on a man who wasn't really my type, but I was more interested in just gaining some experience than finding true love. But little did I know that this decision would change my life forever. We chatted for a while, and he did seem a bit strange, but I didn't mind. He invited me to a restaurant, and so I agreed. When I arrived at the restaurant, it looked abandoned, so I texted him to say I was out front. He then responded, telling me to go around the back because it was a garden restaurant. I did think this was a little odd, but then again, post-COVID, nothing seemed to surprise me anymore. I saw the alleyway next to the restaurant and made my way down. It was dark down that alleyway. I couldn't see much, but I could kind of see an exit, so I carried on walking. When suddenly, I was grabbed from behind and my eyes were covered. I tried to scream, but a hand covered my mouth. I was taken to a dark and scary place, and I had no idea where I was or who had taken me. I was thrown into a small room and my eyes were uncovered. I saw my Tinder date standing in front of me, grinning, but he looked different. His eyes were darker and his smile was wider than I remembered from the pictures. I realised then that I had made a grave mistake. He told me that he had been watching me for weeks and that he was obsessed with me. He said it in a way that was almost trying to impress me. He claimed that he had planned this entire evening just to get me alone with him. I tried to escape, but he was just too strong. He told me that I was going to be his forever. I was trapped in that room for what felt like days. I was starved, cold, and terrified. He would come in occasionally to touch me inappropriately and whisper terrifying things in my ear. He told me that no one was going to save me and that I was going to be with him forever. But I refused to give up. I knew that I had to fight back, no matter what. I mean, what else was I going to do? So when he came in to taunt me once more, I gathered all of my strength and attacked him. I must have caught him off guard, because somehow I managed to break free and run out of the room. I didn't stop running until I reached a busy street. I felt safer, but I was still traumatized. I could have never imagined that my desire for dating experience would lead me down such a terrifying path. I managed to get home safe and I called the police. But from that day on, I vowed to never use Tinder again. I had been swiping through Tinder for weeks now, just looking for the perfect match, when finally, I actually found her. She was beautiful, smart, and seemed to have a great sense of humour. We hit it off right away, and so decided to meet up for drinks at a local bar. When I arrived, she was already there, waiting for me. She looked even more beautiful in person, and I felt like I had really hit the jackpot. We started talking, and everything seemed to be going well. We laughed and joked, and overall just had a great time. But then, things suddenly took a turn for the worse. As the night wore on, she started to get more and more aggressive. She kept grabbing my arm and leaning in close to me, making me feel uncomfortable. I tried to back away, but she wouldn't let me. She just kept talking about how much she wanted me and how she couldn't wait to take me home. I started to get scared. This wasn't what I had signed up for. I tried to tell her that I wasn't interested, but she wouldn't listen. Finally, I managed to break away from her and ran out of the bar. I thought that this would be the end of it, but I was wrong. Over the next few days, she bombarded me with text messages and phone calls, begging me to give her another chance. At first, I ignored her, but then the messages started getting more and more disturbing. It was like she was trying to seduce me, but in the creepiest way possible. Then, one night, I woke up to find her standing in my bedroom. I don't know how she got in, but there she was, staring at me, with a look of obsession in her eyes. I screamed and jumped out of bed, but she just laughed and started walking towards me. I didn't know what to do, so I ran out of the room and called the police. When they finally arrived, they found her hiding in my closet. She had broken in through a window and had been living in my apartment for days, apparently. I was terrified. I had no idea what she was capable of. Even after she was arrested, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me, just waiting for her chance to strike. That Tinder date was by far the scariest experience of my life, and it truly is something that I'll never forget. I'd been talking to a guy on Tinder for quite a few weeks at this point, and we really started to hit it off. He was funny and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, which was rare. So when he suggested to meet up for dinner, I was actually really excited. We agreed to meet at a trendy restaurant downtown. When I arrived, I saw him sitting at the bar, looking just as handsome as his profile picture. We greeted each other with a hug, and I was struck by how warm and genuine he seemed in person. We sat down and ordered some drinks, and our conversation flowed easily. We talked about our jobs, our hobbies, and our families. I felt like I had finally found someone who understood me. But then, things took a turn for the worse. He started talking about his ex-girlfriend, who he had broken up with only a few months ago. At first, I didn't mind listening to him vent about their relationship, because I've had my fair share of train wreck relationships myself. But soon it became clear that he wasn't over her. I noticed that he kept checking his phone, and he seemed distracted by something. He would randomly bring up things that reminded him of her, and it became clear that he was still in love with her. I tried to change the subject, but he kept bringing it back to her. He even pulled out a picture of her from his wallet and showed it to me, telling me how beautiful she was. I realised that I'd clearly made a mistake. This guy was not over his ex, and I was just a rebound. I tried to end the date early, but he insisted on walking me to my car. As we walked, he started getting more and more emotional. He begged me to give him a chance, telling me that he would do anything to make me happy. But I knew that I couldn't be with someone who was still in love with someone else. It's just not possible. I got into my car and locked the doors, feeling relieved to be away from him. But just as I was about to start the engine, he appeared at my window. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face. "Please don't leave me," he begged. "I need you." I tried to ignore him, but he pounded on the window, his face contorted with rage. "I said don't leave me," he screamed. I fumbled for my keys, trying to start the car as quickly as I could. But before I could even turn on the ignition, he had pulled out a knife. I screamed and tried to drive away, but he lunged at the car, slashing at the tyres and smashing against the windows. I could hear him laughing maniacally as I sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. Luckily, I was able to get out of there. I never spoke to that guy again, but I always looked over my shoulder, afraid that he might be following me. The memory of that night has haunted me for years. It's a constant reminder of the danger that can lurk behind even the most charming and seemingly harmless of people. One day, I matched with the cutest girl on Tinder, and the best part was, we hit it off right away. I remember we had talked for a few days, and I felt like I'd finally found someone that I could really be with. Eventually, we agreed to meet up at a park near my house. When I got there, I was immediately struck with the awe of that moment. I felt so lucky to have matched with such a beautiful person. We walked around the park together, just talking and laughing. It was a great day, and I felt like everything was perfect. But then, she started to ask me some rather personal questions, like if I'd ever done drugs or stolen anything. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I didn't want to be rude. Plus, I did really like this girl. But then, almost out of nowhere, she pulled out a joint and offered it to me. I'd never spoken before, and I didn't really want to, but I kind of felt like I had to impress her. I took a few puffs, and soon everything started feeling really weird. I began to feel dizzy and disoriented, like I was in a dream. I could hear her giggling, and she started touching me inappropriately. I tried to push her away, but my body wouldn't respond. She took my hand and led me to a secluded area of the park, and then began to undress me. I felt like I was in a nightmare, but I just couldn't wake up. When it was over, she just left me there, half naked and very confused. I eventually regained my consciousness and stumbled home, feeling violated and scared. Over the next few days, I started experiencing strange symptoms. I felt sick and weak, and I couldn't quite remember what had happened, at least not very clearly. I went to the hospital, and they told me that I had been drugged and sexually assaulted. They tested me for diseases, and I found out that I had contracted an STD. I immediately tried to report her to the police, but I couldn't remember her name or anything about her. I checked her Tinder account, but there was nothing there. She'd clearly deleted it, so she had basically disappeared, leaving me to deal with the aftermath of our horrible date. The police were never able to find her, and to this day, I still feel violated, scared and alone. I never thought a simple Tinder date could turn into something so scary and dangerous. At this point, I must have been swiping through Tinder for weeks. I was hoping to find someone who would be a good match, but then eventually, I came across a profile that caught my eye. He was really handsome, and after speaking for a few days, I realised that we actually did have quite a lot in common. Before long, we had planned our first date, and he suggested that we go hiking in a nearby forest preserve. It seemed quite romantic, so I agreed. We met at the trailhead, and I was immediately struck by how attractive he was in person. He greeted me with a hug, and we set off into the woods. Up until now, I hadn't felt scared whatsoever. The hike was beautiful, and we talked about our interests, our families, and our dreams for the future. But as the sun began to set, things started to feel a little off. As the woods became darker, I noticed that he kept looking over his shoulder and seemed distracted. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shrugged and said he thought he had heard something. I didn't think much of it, and we continued hiking. But as we got deeper into the woods, away from the main trail, I started to feel uneasy. I didn't want to ruin the date by overreacting, so I didn't say anything. But then suddenly, he stopped and turned to me. "I have to tell you something," he said, his voice shaking. "I have a confession to make." My heart started pounding. What could he possibly have to confess? "I'm not really who I said I was on Tinder. My name isn't even Mike, to be completely honest with you. I'm a convicted felon." I froze, my mind racing. What had I gotten myself into? Before I could even respond, he pulled out a knife and pointed it directly at me. "Now, I know that you're not happy about this, but you're going to have to come with me. And if you don't, well, let's just say you wouldn't like what happens next." I was terrified, but I didn't see any other way out. I followed him deeper into the woods, feeling like I was in a nightmare. After what felt like hours of walking, we came to a clearing. There was a small cabin in the centre, and smoke was rising from the chimney. He led me inside, and I saw that there were 2 other men there, who were both big and muscular, and they glared at me as I entered. "This is my girlfriend," he said, gesturing at me. "I want you to treat her with respect." The men just grunted, and I knew then that I was in deep trouble. For days I was trapped in that cabin, living in fear and never knowing when the men would decide to hurt me. I tried to think of ways to escape, but there seemed to be no way out. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, I was able to sneak out of the cabin while the men were sleeping. Usually they'd lock me in a room, but they were drinking quite heavily that night, so I guess they must have just forgotten. I ran as fast as I could through the woods, my heart pounding, and I made it back to civilization. But even though I was now safe, I knew that I would never be the same. That Tinder date had turned into a real-life nightmare, but I was just lucky to have made it out alive. I'd always hated Tinder, but after about 5 years of being single, I finally sucked up the courage and I decided to download the app. I must have been swiping through Tinder for a while before I eventually matched with a guy who actually seemed quite interesting. We started off talking and decided to meet up at a bar in the city. I told my friends about it and they were so excited. I hadn't been on a date in over 5 years, so this was a pretty big deal. When I got there, he had already ordered me a drink, which I didn't realise at the time was kind of odd. I mean, how did he know what I'd even want? Nevertheless, I sat down and we started talking about our interests. I couldn't believe how well we were getting along. We were having such a good time, and that's when we decided to go to another bar down the street. As we were walking, I noticed that he was touching my arm and making some suggestive comments. I brushed it off at first, thinking he was just trying to be playful, and maybe this is what guys were like nowadays. But then he started to get more aggressive. He kept grabbing me, and then he tried to kiss me, even though I told him that I wasn't interested in doing that on a first date. At that point, I tried to leave, but he wouldn't let me. He kept pulling me back and making me feel uncomfortable. I started to feel trapped and scared. Finally, I managed to break away from him and ran out of the bar. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. Over the next few days, he had started stalking me. He would send me constant text messages and phone calls, begging me to see him again. One day he even showed up to my apartment, demanding to be let in so we could talk. I tried to ignore him, but he wouldn't give up. He would follow me around town, showing up at places I liked to hang out. One night I even came home to find him waiting outside for me. But on this particular night, he was holding a knife, and he had a look of pure rage in his eyes. I immediately tried to run in the opposite direction, but he caught up to me and then held the knife to my throat. He told me that he couldn't live without me, and that he would kill me if I tried to leave. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I tried to talk to him, to reason with him, but he was beyond that. He ordered me to go up to my apartment, and so I did as I was told. After we sat down, I waited until my moment. Once he was distracted, I managed to grab the knife from him, and I ran out of the apartment. I pulled out my phone and called the police, but by the time they'd finally arrived, he was already gone. I was so lucky to get away with my life that night, but I was left with a deep sense of fear and some serious trauma. I never thought that a simple Tinder date could turn into something so bad. But I certainly learnt my lesson. So today was the day. I was finally going on a Tinder date with one of the most amazing guys I'd ever met on the app. We decided to meet up at a coffee shop in the city. I felt so lucky to match with him. From our discussions, it seemed that we had a lot in common. We even had the same drinks taste. We sat down and he'd already ordered me my favourite drink, a cappuccino. He had the same thing, and we laughed immediately. Everything was going great. We talked about our interests and hobbies, and he actually seemed genuinely interested in some of the things that I'd say, although there were a few things that he did that raised some red flags. Sometimes he would ask me some really personal questions, for example, like how many sexual partners I had, and if I'd ever tried anything kinky. But he could tell from my responses that I felt uncomfortable, and he'd always stop. But for some reason, the conversation would always lead back to sex. Nevertheless, I kept trying to steer the conversation into some more family-friendly topics. I was telling him about an experience I had with my sister when we went on holiday the previous year and we got into a huge argument. He seemed to be really invested in what I had to say, and I really appreciated having a man actually listen to me for once. But then suddenly, he leaned in and tried to kiss me. I pulled away, but he wouldn't stop. He was grabbing me and trying to kiss me again and again. People started to stare at us at this point, and I got up and tried to leave. But he wouldn't let me. He told me that I owed him since he had paid for my coffee. Finally, I managed to break away from him and I ran out of the coffee shop. But the nightmare was far from over. Over the next few days, he started stalking me. He would send me messages and he'd threaten me over the phone. He even showed up at my school one day, demanding to be let in. I tried to block him, but that wasn't enough. He just wouldn't give up. But then, one night, I was walking home from a friend's house down a dark road when I felt someone grab me from behind. I turned round and saw his face. It was him. He dragged me into an alley and started assaulting me. I tried to fight him off, but he was too strong. In that moment, I felt like I was going to die. After a few minutes, I was ready to just give in. But then finally, someone heard me screaming down the alleyway, and they called the police. He tried to run away, but that night the police found him, and he was arrested. Despite him being caught and being put in prison, I was still left with a deep sense of trauma and fear that still lives with me every day. I was so excited to meet my Tinder date. He seemed so funny and charming through our messages. We decided to meet up at a local coffee shop in the city, and as soon as I saw him, I knew immediately that this date wasn't going to go well. He didn't look anything like his photos, and he had a weird, unsettling energy about him, but I decided to give him a chance, hoping it was just my nerves. We sat down and started talking, but it was clear that we didn't have very much in common. He was also rude to the barista, and didn't seem interested in anything I had to say. He kept checking his phone and was clearly distracted, when suddenly he suggested we go back to his place. I politely declined, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. He became aggressive and insisted that we go to his apartment at once. I started to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make a scene in front of everybody in the coffee shop. So we slowly left together, and I made the stupid decision to get into his car so he could drive me back home. But very quickly I realised we weren't going to my place. When we got to our destination, I noticed that the apartment that was in front of us was dark and dingy. I had a terrible feeling, but I didn't know how to leave. I knew I had to get out of there, but I didn't want to offend him in case he got even more aggressive. He offered me a drink, and I stupidly accepted, hoping that it would calm my nerves and maybe he'd take it as a sign to go easy on me. But soon after that drink, I started to feel dizzy and confused. My vision was blurred, and I realised that he had spiked my drink. I tried to leave, but he'd locked the door and wouldn't let me go. He started to make unwanted advances towards me, and I realised that I was in a dangerous situation. I knew that I had to act fast. I pretended to be sick and ran into the bathroom. I locked the door and searched for any way to escape. Thankfully, I found a window that led to a fire escape. I immediately climbed out of the window and ran out onto the street. I didn't stop until I was a safe distance away, but I was still scared. That night was a real wake-up call for me. I could have died. I realised that I needed to be more careful when it comes to online dating. As soon as I got home, I deleted my Tinder account, and I promised myself that I would never use Tinder again. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.